morning, everyone, and welcome to the fifth or sixth, I'm sorry, geography webinar of the University of the Philippines in Diliman. We started with our webinar last year in in August, and then this is a continuation of it. I'm very proud to present to you today's speaker. Not only is she a very good friend of mine, but let me say a wonderful human being. Pavithra Vasudevan, PhD, got her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and currently she's the assistant professor at the University of Texas in Austin, Department of African and African Diaspora Studies and Center for Women's and Gender Studies. She recently was awarded this year, 2021, the Glendalos Award from the American Association of Geographers, which is an annual award that recognizes outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues. Dr. Vasudevan was awarded for her feminist-inspired participatory action research that is bringing attention to environmental racism among Black communities in North Carolina. And also, interestingly, she staged a play at the UNC Chapel Hill, and I had the pleasure of watching her short film. She did one called Remembering Kearneytown 160. If you want to check her out online, her latest publication came out in 2020 for the Environmental Planning C Politics and Space Journal with her advisor, Sarah Smith, professor from UNC Chapel Hill. The title is The Domestic Geopolitics of Racial Capitalism. Here to talk about one of the things that she worked on for a PhD in North Carolina, which was also the basis of most of her films and most of her engagements, is called An Intimate Inventory of Race and Waste. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pavithra Vasudevan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks to Joseph Paulis. As Joseph said, we're good friends. And Joseph's also been really a very supportive mentor over the years. I'm not going to get into it too much today, but I've experimented with film, performance, and what I will share today is a little bit of poetry. So I especially appreciate the work that Dr. Paulis has done in making creative work and creative scholarship more accepted within the discipline. So I wanted to make sure to thank you, Joseph, for doing that really important work, especially with film and media. I'd also like to thank the American Association of University Women's American Postdoctoral Fellowship Program for giving me some much needed time to write my book, which I'll be talking about at the end of the talk today. My talk is called An Intimate Inventory of Race and Waste. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And please let me know. Do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, but now it's on the wrong screen. Let's stop share. Let's see. Oh, technology. Okay, let's try again. Okay, I think that's what I need to do. Okay, there we are. And you're probably more versed in Zoom than I am. So I think you can, if you want to also see me, there's a way to set it up so you can see the speaker and the screen side by side. So my talk today is called An Intimate Inventory of Race and Waste, which is the title of an article I published in 2020 in the journal Antipode. So I'll begin by introducing the town that's the focus of my ethnographic work. And I'll briefly talk about what environmental racism is, which is the subject of my research. And I'll present a kind of condensed version of the article. And I'll close today with a brief excerpt reading from the book manuscript I'm working on. And so you can see kind of how I'm thinking through this work going forward. Why won't you let me change? Okay, there, great. All right, so the story I'm sharing with you today is about a small town called Badin in North Carolina. Badin was a segregated company town for workers of the Aluminum Company of America, now known as Alcoa, Inc. In its heyday, Badin was a regional destination famed for its amenities, and many residents talk about remembering a good life Today, Badin's mostly what geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls a forgotten place. Forgotten places refers to the places and the people inhabiting them that are abandoned in capitalism's global quest for profit accumulation, those who bear the brunt and the consequences of capitalist development. Badin's story over the course of the 20th century, like many such sacrifice zones, follows a trajectory from a thriving industrial town to a post-industrial site, where issues of contamination, but also of memory and history, emerge as collective reckonings in the wake of economic decline. So here we see on this slide images collected by Alcoa as part of their centennial celebration, 100-year anniversary of the town in 2015. Alcoa's story of Badin, and we might say capitalism's more generally, is one of nostalgic remembrance of a quaint American town where Blacks and whites were able to make good money and make a good life, where toxic exposure was an incidental byproduct and one that was resolved by improved technology. So my research asks, what is the story of racial capitalism when told from the perspective of Black workers and residents of West Badin? I share this story today to suggest that such forgotten places, erased from our collective memory, and their significance questioned even by those who live there sometimes, may in fact be crucial to understanding how capitalism works globally. In April 2016, as part of my ethnographic work, I organized a community feedback meeting in Badin, where professional actors performed a play I scripted from field notes and oral history excerpts. In the dialogue that followed, one audience member stood up and shared the following. I'm Raymond. You told my story. I'm a product of some of the sickness that you're still talking about because I got asbestos in my lungs. And I'm sure there's a whole lot of other guys in here who's got all sorts of complications. So we didn't escape it. We just lived through some of it. I remember when I got in the 25-year club, they told me that I had put my name on the cemetery, that I had joined the death group. I laughed about it and thought it was all funny, but as I lived, it was so true. I'm one of the ones Alcoa told one time that they would spend millions of dollars to keep from giving me a dime. Somebody now will hopefully understand that Alcoa wasn't who we thought they were, that we went through a lot of heartache, suffering, segregation to even be a part of Alcoa. We didn't discuss it with nobody. I think it was shame for a long time because I knew I should have spoke out a whole lot quicker or earlier than I did, but I did not, because the old people would tell me us going off at the mouth would get the plant closed down and they depended on it. For 33 years, Raymond worked for Alcoa at the smelting plant located in North Carolina known as Badin Works. Badin and its sister town of Alcoa, Tennessee, were key sites in aluminum production, smelting primary aluminum for Alcoa, the largest aluminum producer in the US and the third largest in the world, beginning in 1917. Badin is a full company town. The town and surrounding areas are property of Alcoa. There was no separate town council until the 1990s. Residents of Badin have therefore been dependent on Alcoa not only for their livelihoods, but for their very existence as a town. And residents have had little recourse for concerns other than union grievance procedures and direct dialogue with the company. Established as a segregated town for workers in the plant, East Badin, or what's called Badin, is predominantly white, and West Badin, not officially a separate town, continues to only have Black residents. In addition to racial discrimination in the workplace in the town, West Badin residents argue that they have been distinctly and disproportionately impacted by toxic exposure. A grassroots group was formed in 2013 called the Concerned Citizens of West Badin Community to organize around health and environmental contamination, and I've done my work in partnership with this grassroots group. In 2007, after 90 years of operation, the plant was shut down as part of an industry trend to move production overseas. So Alcoa is an absent presence in many ways in Badin, entangled in multiple contestations over contamination. Now I'll take a brief detour through theory, and I promise it's brief, to describe how racism underlies environmental devastation. Badin is a case study of environmental racism, a term first coined by 9-year-old Kim Burwell, whose mother Dolly led a movement against a toxic waste landfill in 1982. On the left, you see an image of these iconic protests for which Warren County, North Carolina, came to be known as the birthplace of environmental justice. And on your right, you see residents and leaders posing with a highway marker commemorating the protest's 30th anniversary. I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you have questions. This is where I did my master's research about the commemoration. Warren County was chosen for a toxic dump site, not only because they were poor, rural, and assumed to be powerless, but because Warren County has a predominantly Black population. To quote Laura Polito, industry and manufacturing require sinks, places where pollution can be deposited. Sinks typically are land, air, or water, but racially devalued bodies can also function as sinks. Ruth Gilmore describes forgotten places like Badin as, quote, planned concentrations or sinks, places that make people of color vulnerable to premature, early, preventable death. Environmental racism refers to both the discriminatory citing of environmental hazards like polluting factories, as well as to those more intangible structural processes of uneven development that result in unequal environments. So racism is not only about intention, but about disparate impact, though these are not mutually exclusive in many of these cases. Cedric Robinson coined the term racial capitalism to describe race as a central operating logic of the political, economic, and social structure of capitalism. In other words, it isn't simply that some workers happen to be white and others happen to be people of color. Rather, racial inequality is fundamental to how labor, land, and waste are valued and distributed in capitalism. My work builds on this key lesson we've learned from the environmental justice movement. The racial hierarchies that value people differently become a way to externalize the environmental costs of capitalism. And I'm moving now to the paper. In a poem titled Inventory, Black Caribbean poet Dion Brand takes stock of the state of the world at the turn of the millennium. The steel we poured, the rivets we fastened, to our bare bones like cars, we did all this and more. So hard now to separate what was them from what we were, how imprisoned we are in their ghosts. These brief excerpts offer a glimpse into Dion Brand's approach to tracing structural oppression through embodied and affective residues. Cultural studies scholar Badin calls Brand's approach an intimate inventory to, quote, recognize how the ghosts of slavery and those of capitalist ideologies have become intertwined in our very subjectivities and bodies. West Badin's Black residents struggle with the environmental and social wreckage of what once seemed like a hopeful future. Traces of the history that produced West Badin are scattered among homemade scrapbooks and muted recollections of endless hours spent caring for dying family, deposited in arthritic joints, cancerous organs, failing lungs, and disappeared into the neighboring woods and placid waters of Badin Lake. This miscellaneous objects, archival fragments, and affective landscapes comprise an intimate inventory of how racism and toxic waste have become intimately interwoven in Badin to produce aluminum as something that is vital and valuable. This is a very busy map, but I'll just point out the three numbers, which I'm going to refer to. Badin constitutes what feminist science studies scholar Michelle Murphy calls a landscape of exposure. In addition to about 200 occupational, that is work-related exposure lawsuits, Badin residents are negotiating environmental contamination as well. And one of the reasons this map is overwhelming, of course, is to give you a feeling and a sense of how much is actually going on there, because it's really hard, of course, to visualize, right, toxicity at all these levels. Soil and water sampling indicate excessive levels of toxins, including fluoride, cyanide, volatile organic compounds, and polychlorinated biphenyls in the vicinity of the plant, the town, and surrounding areas. This cartography of toxicity is both diffuse, impacting all of Badin's residents, and concentrated, deposited into specific sites that impact Black life in particular ways. In the article, I analyze ethnographic material in relation to 3 sites that are relevant to West Badin residents. The first section, which is actually numbered 2 here, titled Care, which I'll talk about in greater depth today, focuses on the aluminum plant itself, called Badin Works, and the West Badin residential area across the street from the plant, where multiple generations of Black workers lived with their families. The second section, numbered 1, sorry, this is confusing, but I switched the order, titled Innocence, addresses the Alcoa Badin landfill, located adjacent to the West Badin residential area and nearby Little Mountain Creek. The landfill was the main dump site for lethal industrial waste from the plant, but also functioned as a kind of commons for West Badin residents, which is, of course, as you all are quite aware, I'm sure, very common experience in many poor communities globally. Even with such explicit discrimination, a lethal dump site in the Black side of town, the question of culpability becomes complicated. Rather than serving as evidence of Alcoa's will to harm, the landfill became normalized as a part of everyday life of Black residents, masking the ways that these conditions were created. The third section of the article, titled Pleasure, looks at Badin Lake, a repository for outflows from the plant, from the factory, and an important social site for Badin residents. I talk about the lake in the article as a kind of dystopic dreamscape that has perverted one's pleasurable memories with awareness of toxicity. Christina Sharp uses the term monstrous intimacies to describe how present-day anti-Black racism repeats the violations of slavery and yet are, quote, read or re-inscribed as consent and affection, intimacies that involve shame and trauma and their transgenerational transmission. Building on Sharp, I describe how racialized toxicity produces an intimate monstrosity that is both affective and material. Affective meaning that Black folks are entangled through geographies of home and household, family, body, sexuality, and emotion, and material because they're reproduced, the anti-Black racism is reproduced through the interactions of humans and bacteria, toxins, and technology alike. Care. I'm sitting with Frank and Myrna in their living room. Frank worked at Alcoa for 25 or 30 years, as did his father and many of their uncles. He tells me about what Alcoa means to their family, describes how they provided the community with good housing, decent wages, even free water. Back then, he says nostalgically, when Alcoa first come, it was real nice. Frank and Myrna feel like the company has now abandoned them in West Badin. Their feelings reflect an internal struggle for many Black residents in the aftermath of the plant closure. In this section, I analyze the relations of care that facilitated the reproduction of capitalism in Badin. During fieldwork, I expected to learn about exploitation, but not to be confronted everywhere by expressions of care that intensified Black dependence and vulnerability. Racism made the aluminum plant a valuable experimental space for capital, where Black bodies were used as labor and toxic receptacle. While I repeatedly heard Black residents talk about how the factory was a good life compared to sharecropping, their lived experiences and descriptions suggest otherwise, revealing disturbing continuities between plantation life and factory life. For the first 50 years of the plant's functioning, Black men were hired for the most difficult and dirtiest jobs, known as the bull gang, the crew that tended the giant aluminum pots, as they're called, in which bauxite ore was melted under heavy pressure and high heat to extract liquid aluminum. Daniel, a white resident and former Alcoan who curates a local history museum, explained to me, Alcoa actually had fellows out riding the roads to these farms and cotton fields. They hired the Blacks and brought them up here out of the fields. You know, they could stand the heat. They had a lot of heat in the pot room. It takes 1,300 degrees to melt aluminum. I mean, it gets hot, hot, hot. Notwithstanding Daniel's privilege in voicing these thoughts to me, the illogic that Black bodies could, quote, stand the heat that white bodies could not, undergirded Alcoa's labor divisions. Black workers were subject to lethal conditions on the assumption of superhumanness, reflecting early 20th century eugenic discourses. In this furnace of aluminum smelting, I suggest that toxins found new life in Black bodies. We can only speculate about how chemical agents, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, benzenes, asbestos, fluoride, and polychlorinated biphenyls, have altered the cells, organ systems, and the very corporeality of the Black bodies that absorbed them. Conversely, Black workers literally gave their lives to aluminum by caring for the pots. Workers' descriptions of endless hours spent, quote, tending to the pots, keeping the fire going, and cleaning crust off the rims resonate with feminist descriptions of social reproduction or life's work. Only here, carbon, iron, and aluminum were tended into becoming the vital infrastructures of modernity. A statement by West Baden resident Jason that, quote, a lot of the Blacks gave their blood, sweat, and life to making aluminum is more material reality than metaphor. This exploitation relied upon and extended into networks of care outside the workplace, where cruelly women and children were bound to waste as well through their care work, specifically washing clothes. Francis, I can remember my daddy coming home, and we would have to wash his work clothes, and it would be so smutty. And even if you wash it, you could still see it. I mean, it would be on his skin. I was truly shocked when Frank and Myrna, in discussing the quote laundry situation during our interview, casually mentioned that they only received uniforms from Alcoa in the 1990s. Alcoa's repeated evasions of responsibility, including denying medical illnesses caused by toxic exposure, fighting workers at every turn, even blaming them during settlements for advanced illnesses, are a bitter pill to swallow for West Baden community members who fondly describe their relationship to Alcoa through the language of care. Workers speak of the factory as a family. They took care of us, I heard more than once, and they reminisce about family day at Alcoa. Both men and women were made complicit through gendered relations of care, as Black men gained respect through becoming Alcoans. As Raymond told me, I had the opportunity to build a nice house, all the things that made a man look like a man. I had access to it through Alcoa, but I didn't know at that particular time that I was selling my soul to the devil. Now that the plant is closed, residents express a sense of abandonment and betrayal by the company they once saw as a benevolent father figure. Their sense of betrayal reveals, to quote Christina Sharp, the everyday mundane horrors that are not acknowledged to be horrors, in this case of aluminum production. Horrors such as the brutal labor of caring for aluminum pots and the corresponding domestic labor of caring for neglected workers reproduces a monstrosity of racialized capitalism, predating upon the very networks of care that sustain Black life in the face of state neglect. The toxic entanglements of race and waste in Baden manifest in disconcertingly familial relations in the factory, in quotidian practices of caregiving, and in affectively charged natural landscapes. In the dystopic design of this aluminum town, the built environment comes to be considered family, and nature is distorted to serve as a tool of racial capitalism, enmeshing residents in a web of toxicity. Dion Brand's poetry offers a Black feminist approach to tracing how race and waste become entangled in our very bodies and psyches, leaving traces of the monster that was once separate. Quote, so hard now to separate what was them from what we were. In this paper, I describe aluminum production as an intimate monstrosity, a monster that feeds on the everyday intimacies of Black life politically and ecologically. The monstrosity lies in how Black people are made to feel complicit in their own subjugation, denied access to innocence, care, or pleasure as sources of hope. Quote, on reading this, someone will say, God, is there no happiness then? I began with Raymond, who had said at the community meeting, we didn't discuss it with nobody. I think it was shame for a long time. Raymond later told me that he had spent his life working for Alcoa, hoping to make a better life for his children. But he hadn't bargained that the toxic exposure he faced was being passed on to his family as well. As he's begun to face the unreasonable economic exchange he had made in the name of a job, he's also had to come to terms with the fact that his job required him to dump the waste in the neighborhood of West Baden, and that perhaps he too is responsible. Like other Black residents of Baden, Richard's recountings are tingled with feelings of complicity and cooptation and recognition, not only of the harm done to them, but of how they have been made participant in this tremendous apparatus of harm. Intimate inventories like this one reveal that structural oppression implicates us all, even those, disturbingly, who are most directly terrorized by such violence. Perhaps the task of inventory is a truer accounting in order to disrupt the violent reproduction of racial capitalism. Some words, Dion Brand says, can make you weep. When they're uttered, they break all places intended and known. Such an inventory makes space for a public reckoning. If we are to find a way forward, we must all bear witness to and acknowledge these intimate monstrosities. My research in Badin was developed in collaboration with two community partners. The North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, a statewide advocacy organization, and the Concerned Citizens of West Badin Community, a grassroots community group in Badin. On the left, you see a photograph of Naima Mohammed, who was the co-director of the EJ network, seated, and a longtime organizer who was also my co-PI and did many of the interviews with me. She's seated in the home of Ms. Tilly Ray Wallace, a recently deceased elder of West Badin, who had been documenting Badin's history for decades in homemade scrapbooks. On the right, you see a still from the closing moment of the play, which ended with a question Ms. Wallace had posed to me, a question that invokes us all as witnesses to the story of this forgotten place, which is at once the history of racial capitalism writ large. Now that you've heard my story, she said, what will you do? I've been carrying that question with me for many years and thinking about how, as researchers, we're also storytellers who inform how people can understand the world. So I'll close the talk today with a brief reading from my book in progress titled Toxic Alchemy, Black Life and Death in Industrial Capitalism. In the chapter I'm reading from today, I reconsider the inventory as a tool of capitalism. The conventional inventory is an itemized list of assets produced by identifying and categorizing the stock of resources or goods of value. I show how the inventory normalizes capitalism's logic through devious record keeping by erasing or redacting the social and environmental costs of production. I then write against the inventory by producing a counter inventory, following the trail of waste proliferated along the chain of global aluminum production. I'll read you a brief excerpt from the opening section, followed by one of a series of poems which reveal how capitalism creates value by racializing people as disposable. This poem is about Suriname, where in 1958, the local minister and the Dutch governor signed a 75-year agreement with Alcoa to build aluminum production facilities and a dam to power them. In 1964, the dam flooded out 6,000 Samaka people living in 43 villages, Maroon communities who had lived autonomously for 200 years after gaining freedom from slavery. Through the inventory. To inventory the externalities of racial colonial capitalism is to chronicle injustice, to challenge the reproduction of harm that seems inevitable through the accumulation of evidence where no amount of evidence would suffice. We see that what appears as normal is made to seem so by bureaucratic apparatuses and tools such as the inventory. The vaulted institutions of state and science are bureaucracies of epistemic violence, legitimating the grammar of racial colonial violence as reasonable and justifiable. Inventory is both noun and verb. To counter the capitalist inventory, we must inventory injustice. We must tell the stories that lie between the lines and off the margins of capitalist ledgers to reveal the purposeful misaccounting by which capitalism comes to appear as a solid reality. In this inventory, I account for the incalculability of all that is made illegible by the grammar of value. I take stock of the sacrifices, the erasures, and the sublimations of the precious life worlds and irreplaceable histories required for aluminum to be made. What follows is a list of lists, a compilation of marginalia that comprise homemade scrapbooks passed on amongst those displaced from homes and archives that appear and disappear momentarily from newspaper headlines, as though the residues of racial colonial devastation are mere ephemera. Following in the lineages of crónicas and testimonios, of Black prophetic poetics and blues vernaculars, I reimagine the inventory through storytelling. This inventory of stories comprise a corpus of evidence that together charge racial colonial capitalism and call for the end of this world. This inventory of suffering, this registry of harm, this litany of loss asks at the end, is aluminum worth all that it costs? Suriname be damned. Before rainforest retook village, before sewage flooded workers' quarters, before the factory that shut down, before this crisis grew debts, before the power outages, before electricity was perpetual promise, before handshake of country and colonial guest who stayed so long, their pockets make money when lights turn on, before migration from poor to poor, before pensions couldn't pay for inflation, before handouts, the handfuls of jobs, before logos on school clothes meant no need for textbooks, before fights between neighbors cooped in houses like chickens, before no meat to eat when before we could hunt, before faucets streamed lies, before river be damned, before mining zaboon and smelting went bust, turning town into dust, before curse of red soil made coins out of ore, conjured factory from plantation's corpse. As the water arose, they did pray to our gods, the water to hold back, but rise did the water, flood did the jungle, submerged did the world of those once who were free. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this talk or about my research in general.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasudevan, for the wonderful and at times very touching presentation. And I like the fact that you also used poems and other evocative utterances in the written form by some of those people who experienced this type of environmental duress and racism that we had to go through. At this point, I was wondering if there are some questions. You can either just post them in chat or just use your microphone if you want to speak something. But maybe I'll just get started just to make sure. Um, this is a little bit probably not so much on the topic itself, but there are some students in this presentation who may be interested and fascinated to know how you were able to weave a more creative approach towards understanding the complexity and the relatedness of this issue in Alcoa, in North Carolina.
Sure. I'm happy to share that. I'm sorry I didn't talk too much about the methodology today. Just I thought I could answer questions, but I use a methodology called critical performance ethnography, which is kind of a variation on conventional ethnography or more critical ethnography, but using the tools of performance studies throughout the research process. So, for example, in transcribing interviews, I might use a method called ethnopoetic transcription, which is used in performance studies to try to capture not only the text of what people say, but a sense of the their emotional state, of the silences and pauses, and to actually translate that as well into the text, the same way you might include screen directions, right, in playwriting. So that's one example of a tool. But similar to that, there's throughout the research process, I use tools from performance studies. So in this dissertation, for example, in my research, the play initially was not for a public audience. It was not a general public audience. It was for the community in Badin, because I had done this research as part of the community organizing. So this was a way for me to share back with people, not just the people who spoke to me, but their family and friends, about the kinds of stories I was hearing that often they weren't telling each other, right? So that's something that, company towns are notoriously, they're it's complicated because a lot of people feel loyalty to the company or obligation, but also fear. There's been a lot of intimidation over generations. So a lot of times people wouldn't share these stories even with their own families. And for that reason as well, I think creative work can be very powerful. So putting on the play, the first version of the play, and I shared, one of the audience members' quotes from Raymond, but there were many others as well who spoke up and started sharing all these family histories. And and when I say family histories, I mean things like, about, I remember this one woman talked about her father who had to go to 4 different doctors to get a proper diagnosis because so many doctors in the area were kind of in cahoots with Alcoa. And so they'd keep saying like, well, there's nothing really wrong with you. And that was a very common thing I heard actually, that, this kind of misdiagnosis or just straight, deceit, doctors lying. And there's a lot of stories around related to health and illness. There's a lot of stories about people speaking up and being punished. And then there were other stories like the scrapbook, the idea for, collecting scrap information from scrapbooks came for me because I had seen one, but I hadn't quite understood until after the play, because suddenly a lot of people started saying, oh, my aunt keeps a scrapbook, my aunt keeps a scrapbook. And we realized that's one of the ways that so many elderly women in the community were actually documenting the history, even though it wasn't being spoken about publicly. So I think for me, creativity isn't simply, putting on the play. It's actually recognizing the kind of creativity in people's lives, in the ways that their politics, as well as in the ways they speak or don't speak about things, right? And working with them to figure out what is the story to tell. So that was part of the reason to put on the play, was to say, here's what I'm hearing. Is this what, does this actually reflect your experience? And so, my research, I think, only always gets richer in that sense because it's a dialogue. So every stage, when I write something, for example, and with this book as well, I'm hoping to, go back and share it and hear back from people. Does this story reflect your experience? Is it different than what you had imagined? And of course, as a storyteller, what I say is never going to be exactly the story, right, that any individual there would tell. It's a compilation, but it's also something else then, because I'm thinking of the story of the town. So I'll leave it at that, Joseph, kind of a general.
I love it. I thank you for that very enlightening answer, because there's a lot of us, for example, who can profit from using those what you call, especially critical performance ethnography. I know Chris Cortain did that too. One of our colleagues did that, and it's so wonderful to see it animate geographies that you do. Maybe just a quick one before I ask the person who was raising his hand. But there have been some studies also about some diasporic Vietnamese women in the US who had to use performance in order to convey to their own folks what it means to be displaced, that they cannot do otherwise on a typical kind of conversation. So that was a way to somehow validate their stories, but done in a creative, dialogic kind of way. So thank you very much. And Pavithra just sent us the wow the the citation, which you can look at. Is this Suyini from UNC Communication? Is this the same? Oh, okay, yeah, I love her. Can I call on Matthias Westwood to just unmic yourself and then just ask your question?
Yes. So I was interested in the pattern you observed here of how part of the devastation of this environmental racism is not only the degradation and damage that is done to these communities, but the way in which they're made to feel complicit through this sense of loyalty and through the sense of care and community, that they took actions in the expectation that their loyalty to the company would be, reciprocated. And I wonder if you could say something more to sort of that aspect of the relationship between capitalism and racialized bodies.
Sure. So I think, I mean, with company towns, and it's not right particular to Alcoa or aluminum, right? In a certain way, um, there's a kind of, I want to say conflict of interest is a weird word, but for a lot of workers, their livelihoods, and so, their entire lives in some sense become structured by and indebted to the company. This is very common, right? We see this a lot in different kinds of companies. And it's also more generally true, I think, for many of us, like in academia, for example, right? Our sense of what is important and our lives become really tied around industry in a certain sense. Though, of course, it's hard to see in academia in the same way. But I think I was also making the point which you raised, right, that for Black folks in particular, part of the way this operated, and with Alcoa, in this moment where a lot of people were coming from a background, and not just a background, but they were coming from sharecropping, right? So people early on in Alcoa's history, Black workers who were coming out of sharecropping, which is, for the students here, kind of form of agricultural labor where you're in some sense indebted to, you're expected to work there. It's kind of, in a certain way, a kind of bonded labor. You're not, it's not slavery, but it is functions in some similar ways to make people precarious, where they are dependent on that, working on the land. And it's, very precarious. It's also physically demanding. And so for a lot of people who are coming out of sharecropping, industrial labor, like, working at Alcoa, was a huge opportunity, right? I mean, it came with, in some ways, education, not just what we think of as school education, but industrial education, technical education. It came with higher wages. So there's also loyalty was, manufactured in more ways than one. So I heard that often from people that, they were proud of the work they did, which is important, I think. The work they did was advanced technical labor. It's not just, even though on the hierarchy of labor within aluminum smelting, many of the Black workers were seen as doing the least technical or least involved labor, but that itself is part of the erasure, I think. The work itself was important, right? And people took pride in their work. They took pride in having, gaining community respect as having these stable jobs. But those forms of loyalty were also used to undermine people's ability to determine, right, the course of their lives in many ways, including, as I've pointed out, right, some ways around health, what happens with their families, their safety and security, and that there's few people even now who speak very openly, speak out against Alcoa there. And I think that's part of that loyalty and intimidation. And, I mean, we're talking about one of the largest multinational corporations, right? That's intimately woven with like warfare, US empire. I mean, they have lawsuits everywhere Alcoa operates, there's lawsuits. I mean, it was like staggering to me just to think about, wow, in this one site, you have 200 plus just occupational injury lawsuits, which aren't public record. So we don't know like the details of them, but that's workers who are sick and or dying or dead from exposure to toxins. So anyway, it's a long roundabout answer, but I think there is, what was interesting but complicated for me was my responsibility, I would say, or like the challenge of being able to speak to that reality, even though people would say to me that they often couldn't speak it openly themselves. And I think that's part of how capitalism operates, right? It's by this kind of indebtedness that that workers and residents and all of us kind of have to companies. That doesn't allow us to maybe be able to also say, but that doesn't make it a fair trade for what happened.
Thank you. Thank you, Pavithra. Are there any questions or any kind of provocation or maybe things that resonate with you in the talk of Dr. Vasudevan, in from methods to content, and also general um, remarks or questions about environmental racism in general. Are there any other questions? Bobby, can I just ask one quick one? So what's going on right now in Badin? Uh, do you have any update about with them? And just to run us through.
Yeah, so the occupational injury stuff is, as I was saying, it's not really public record. They kind of like civil injury lawsuits, so we don't really know. I mean, probably from the anecdotally, what I know is many people, won some level of a settlement, but often the settlements were downgraded. It seems to have been differences in who was awarded what in terms of the settlements, and of course, settlements don't change the fact that many people, many workers, have died from illness. And on the illness side of things, I mean, that was one of the major concerns that residents kept bringing up. There were no real medical studies done or anything like that. And it's actually really hard to pinpoint, even with, a factory, like one factory there, to say that that was the cause of particular illnesses. But what we have been able to do, I worked with the epidemiologist and various other, the community organizations, and we've kind of involved in a long-term collaboration around, it's not a medical study, but it's a public health study, it's an epidemiology study. And so we have looked at company records and union records to be able to validate what workers have been saying, which is that it is true that there was, racial disparity in terms of the level of job hazard, as well as in certain illnesses. So for example, in terms of mortality from cancer. So I think that's an important thing that we were able to do. Mostly it's a confirmation. It's not, it's changing anyone's situation. But I think that's actually important. And it was one of the first studies that's been published around racial disparities in relation to aluminum smelting, which is really wild to think about because we know that industrial labor is very racialized and racially divided. So the fact that there aren't more studies is disturbing, but I think, the companies control a lot of the data, so it's hard to prove. So in Badin itself, I haven't been able to go back now for quite a while with the pandemic. But I think, everyone is under lockdown and living pandemic life. So, we'll see how folks are doing. But in terms of the various lawsuits, there's kind of multiple ones in terms of the environmental side. So there's a kind of solid waste, like the landfill I'd shown you. And so a couple of those lawsuits are kind of ongoing. And when I say lawsuit, we think of it as like trial going to court, but more likely often what they are very protracted regulatory struggles. People, like there's a set of lawyers out of Duke's Environmental Law and Policy Clinic who have been kind of keeping this up, gathering evidence, pursuing Alcoa, and then Alcoa will kind of come back and try to say that they're not doing what they said they would. And so that's ongoing. And there was some success with a different lawsuit. So it's kind of, they've won certain things. And I think it's important to actually mark those victories because it's really hard to win against companies like Alcoa. But yeah, it's hard. I think a lot of people are, we hear about people still dying, and throughout the course of my research, actually, even in the process of it, I would hear like, workers being like, "Oh, I talked to so and so, he worked with me in the bull gang, or he was a truck driver with me, and he just passed away from this kind of cancer." So the wins sometimes feel too little, too late, but I think they're still really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. There's a comment here in the chat. You can probably read it, but it's interesting how these arrangements are so common, especially here in the Philippines and other parts of the global south. There is a direct lineage between histories of racialized colonial exploitation to commercial debt bondage because of our encounters and experiences with say it nicely, occupations in the Philippines from Spain to the US and to various others, new global orders and positions in our country, you could see that manifest in tiny little ways and sometimes in macro scales as well. So I'm happy that Christina Saison was able to find that connection with our own experience. Uh, Christina, do you want to say something maybe just to build on that before we wrap this session?
Hi. I just, I guess because I went to law school a while back, like 10 years ago. I wasn't able to finish, but I I encountered many court cases, particularly in Mindanao, in relation to workers exposed to pesticides and other kinds of harmful uh, farming inputs, for instance. And what I'm seeing, also because I come from Negros Occidental, which is, of course, one of the places where sugarcane monocropping continues to be a part of the system. And what what I see is this really, like, the ones who are controlling things continue to be uh, mestizo people, in a manner of speaking. And often the ones who are the most affected by, for example, the arriendo system we have here, which involves a debt bondage um, that is linked to an attachment to land that uh, basically ties the smallholder to the landlord. And the ones who are most affected are often very much people who come from, let's say, indigenous stock, if I might say, while at the same time, the ones who are often the landlords or the people who have a hold on the resources, control over resources, tend to be mixed, usually Chinese and Spanish, sometimes even other ethnicities. So it was an observation that I saw that seems to continue to this day because of the fact that some people, basically, power seems to congregate in on itself, so that there's a continuing separation between certain groups of people. I'm not saying that, like, there's an absolute gap between um, Filipinos who are darker skinned and Filipinos who are lighter skinned. That's not the case at all. But there is kind of a similar um, dynamic, I guess. That was my observation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. That was a wonderful uh, link, I guess, to. I know what she's talking about, but I was also born in central Philippines in Negros Occidental, and I know those sugarcane areas. I grew up there as well. So the issues. Is there anyone else? Oh, sure.
I just wanted to, can I respond real quick?
Sure, you sure.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I don't know the Philippines context, but I think it's interesting because I think the language of racial capitalism, right, has been kind of theorized predominantly through Black experience in the Americas. And of course, there's indigenous studies work on settler colonialism. And what's interesting is to think about also these concepts of racial colonial capitalism, right, in a global context. And I'm not surprised to hear what you're saying, because I think there's actually a lot of, when we think about like the kind of what a certain political economic regime was under colonialism, how it changes, right, over time, there are linkages. And of course, the people, I mean, it's not like rocket science, right? To understand that, of course, the people who had power, whether that was in terms of land ownership or access to colonial resources, are of course become, in a certain sense, neo-colonial elites, right? And I think there's even more work to do to understand that kind of racial aspect of it, what that means, because I think we often think of race only in terms of skin color, but we also know like race is a social construct. It's not a biological reality, but it becomes made a reality in a certain way by reproducing these hierarchies. So I'm actually working on a special issue thinking about the question of race and racialization in India, which is not where, it's not coming from the same kind of the Americas, right? And transatlantic slave trade, it's totally different context. And yet we see very interestingly similar dynamics in terms of racialization of what were previous hierarchies there. So there, in terms of caste, in terms of tribes or indigenous people that we call tribes in India, that they're racialized, and they were racialized. There was already those hierarchies. They were racialized during colonialism in British, French colonialism in India in certain ways, and then post-colonially continue to be, right, that those racial hierarchies are reproduced, even though are not absolute, and they may not seem to make sense in terms of race. So I actually think you're making a very important observation in terms of how there's a racial aspect to how, colonization translates into, what we think of as post-colonial economic systems, and how they're actually in some ways can be exacerbated in the new kind of industries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there one last question before we wrap things up? Yes, Mylene.
Hello, Pavi. Thank you for that presentation. Actually, when you were talking about expression and narratives of care from the workers, it reminded me of what I saw in the southern part of the Philippines, where copper mining and gold mining was very big in this area in South Cotabato, in Sultan Kudarat. And the indigenous peoples were actually sharing those expressions of gratitude that when the mining was in there were no roads, etc. But at the same time, they also showed us like lakes and bodies of water that were not that became toxic because of the mine tailings. But actually, my comment, actually, this is just a curiosity. So I don't know if you during the course of your ethnographic work, if you were able to talk with some of the children of the workers. I'm just wondering if they also shared that kind of point of view of seeing Alcoa as a benevolent father that makes it possible for them to have houses, to have education, to have things. And I'm just wondering if the children have any sort of idea of what is going on, what their parents are going through. I guess that would be my question. Thank you again, Pavi.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, I think mining is another, right? Obviously, with aluminum too, there's bauxite mining, and sort of related but different set of issues there, where it's like in some ways landscapes get devastated in mining, and mining communities. You both have like the communities that used to live there that get displaced, some of whom become involved in mining in the industry, and many of whom don't. So that was also the case in the Suriname poem I was reading, which is not my ethnographic work, but based on secondary research. And you have these very mixed reactions to mining because it makes development possible or makes education possible. But yeah, the children question, it's it's tough. I worked through this community organization, so I know the children, the young people they weren't so much children. I would say they were more teenagers, right? Or young adults who were involved, and many of those young people know what's happening because they come with their parents to the meetings, right? I didn't interview them separately, so I only know from their participation, or meeting them at home and informal conversations. I didn't get to meet too many other children, but the sense I get actually from many of the workers who are older now is that a lot of them actually haven't talked to their children. So I imagine, and I thought I might actually do a follow-up at some point, try to reach out to their children, and that didn't happen. But I actually imagine that many of their children may not know these stories and may actually feel quite positively about the company in some ways. But I can't say that for sure. So yeah, maybe there's some follow-up to be done, or maybe there's a way actually through more writing I can reach out to them. And but yeah, thank you for bringing that up. There's like interesting questions, I think, about generations, and and the oldest people I talked to many of them in their 90s were very fond of the company, actually, because for them it was and they were the ones who would tell that kind of middle age group, like, don't say anything, even though it was becoming evident that it was that they were not being treated well, or that there were consequences that but thank you for the question.
That's a wonderful provocation, Lance, because it also complexifies this big question, not just in race and environment, but also social relations, which is always entangled with the whole issue. At this point, I feel like we probably need to let Pavi have an early good night's sleep. Thank you, Pavi, for staying and giving a talk to our webinar. I know it's late for you in Austin right now, and we're grateful for this opportunity to hear scholars such as you relate your research to us. And we, as based on the questions we in comments here, we were able to even find connections here in the Philippines. And it's a disturbing, troubling world we live in. But then again, the tiny geographies that are still we are entangled with are just as problematic. So the best way is probably forge forward, find a solidarity with people who constantly had to question this status quo and establishment. At this point, I would like to give a certificate of appreciation to Pavithra. It's for the valuable insights and expertise shared as a virtual resource speaker for the talk called an intimate inventory of race and waste for the geography webinar colloquium series given today. Well, to you is the 27th, but to us is already the 28th of April 2021, signed by yours truly as the coordinator of the webinar, and Yanni Lopez, the chair of the Department of Geography. For those of you who are tuning in, we have a few more webinars coming up for the semester. One is also a friend of Pavithra and myself, Linda Kikiewicz, who's going to give a talk about her dissertation in Palestine. It's going to happen on May 6, 2021 at 5:30 p.m. And Lou Angeli Ocampo is going to give a talk on May 14. It's hazardscape and risk perception, so don't miss that. And finally, from the UP Anthropology Department, Cultural Memory for Disaster Risk Reduction from Dr. Sol Dalisay. So we hope to see you there. And this continues this great conversation about geography in our lives. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bobby, for gracing us again.
Of course. And I can, if you want to end the recording, I can hang out for a few minutes.
I was wondering if you could also provide us with your email, just in case there are people who want to reach out.
Oh, sure, of course.
In case you have some questions that I would rather ask you via email. Mads just asked this question about this interesting, also how to tie up maybe the scrapbooking to other expressions and documentation of their histories, probably through the use of social media for the much younger adult generations. So thank you. I joined.
Is it? Would it be possible for me to get a copy of the chat, Joseph?
Yeah, we can do that because it's recorded.
If you don't mind, just
yeah, absolutely, we can do that for you, and I'll send to you. The whole recording will be posted on YouTube, but the actual chats, I'll send the transcripts to you.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah,
thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Wish I could be there in person. Maybe next time.
Darlene just said that was a great presentation. It resonates the conditions of our communities who are put in the same situation and conditions. It strikes a chord in our hearts. Thank you for sharing your research. Thank you.
Thank you.